as things continue to heat up in the Russia-Ukraine war, we're actually getting some clarity on some things where some of the senior officials in both the United States and in Ukraine are laying out very coherent, clear positions. No, I'm kidding. You know that's never going to happen. In fact, we have something close to the opposite. You do have very significant statements coming out and very declaratory statements, but they're very often at odds with one another. And nearly all of them are at odds with what's happening on the ground. And as we keep telling you over and over, what the reality on the ground is the one thing that matters the most. And words are only important if they match what the reality is. And when they don't, we're going to call that out. And back today with us is Colonel Jacques Baud to talk through this. And I'm so happy to have him back. We hadn't had him on in a while. A retired member of the Swiss intelligence service, former NATO officer. And Colonel, first of all, it's just great to have you back.
Yeah, nice to be back with you. Thanks.
And, I'd love to have you on sometime. Maybe, I don't know, talk about different coffee brands or maybe fishing or, it would be enjoyable. But we seem to always bring you on to talk about really challenging stuff, but we're grateful to have you. So I guess let's just jump into this one. The one thing I want to lead off with here is what's in the news right now is that the United States, apparently, according to reports, Joe Biden is actually giving not just apparently thinking about it, but he's said they're trying to work it out to give permission for the Ukraine side to use American long-range weapons anywhere in the territory of Ukraine. Now, I just wonder, before I even get into any of the details of this, what your off-the-cuff view is of that whole process?
Well, first of all, we had contradictory comments in the West, generally speaking, because we had different countries, UK, for instance, and France, already making statements about the authorization of having for the long-range weapons into Russian territory. We had contradictory statements from the US, who US authorized for a while and then came back and backpedal on that. And we eventually, my understanding is that so far the US has only authorized the use of long-range weapons just in the border area, in the region of Belgorod and Kharkov, but not in the depths, in the strategic depths of the Russian territory. But there were contradictory comments from various officials in the US. And in my view, this shows the desperation of the West. I mean, they don't have a strategy to address the Ukraine question, and they don't have any exit strategy. And in my view, this is just a way to prolong the conflict. And I think that Zelensky would like to extend the conflict up to the US presidential election, at least, and then probably find a solution. But I think so until the election, he wants to have, let's say, a military solution or a military attempt to solution, because himself.
Let me ask you that. First of all, just on the tactical situation of it, let's see what is, and forget it for the moment. Don't even worry about a Russian reaction. But what about militarily about this use of weapons? Because Zelensky keeps asking for it. He's saying it's necessary to be able to hit airfields and the arms depots, et cetera. How much use could these missiles affect by launching strategic on the fight itself?
No, not tactically, but I think it's a matter of strategy. You see, if we come back to the basic of Clausewitz's strategy, we know that the center of gravity is, in fact, what defines the capability of a country to fight. And in the assessment of the Russian assessment, but also the Ukrainian assessment, the center of gravity of the Russians is the stability of the country. That's the reason why Vladimir Putin made every effort to maintain the conflict outside of the Russian territory and tried to improve the daily life of the Russians. So this is the idea of keeping the stability on Russian territory while maintaining the conflict. I mean, military operations outside of the conflict. That's also the reason why it's called a military operation and not a war against Ukraine, by the way. And the Ukrainians have understood that. And early this year, Zelensky has said several times that his objective is to bring war on the Russian territory. And that's what, in fact, they have done many times by with terrorist activities, for instance, against Tatarsky, Alexander Dugin, or attacks against oil refineries, or attacks against Belgorod, for instance, just bombing civilians.
Yeah.
It's just to make the Russians feel the war. And all these attempts, including some attempts on the Kremlin, if you remember, with drones
right.
and things
I
like
remember that.
Yeah, and that's part of a strategy to bring the war on the Russian territory. And now they notice that this has not. I mean, this has not made any kind of destabilization in Russia itself, because the name of the game is, as it was since the very beginning of the. I mean, since 2021. And I would even say 2019, as Alexei Arestovich said it, the idea is to destabilize the political power in Russia and to have a regime change in Russia. That's the name of the game. And for that reason, Ukraine needs to bring the war on the territory. That's also the purpose of the sanctions, by the way.
Right.
And
but now let's look at that, especially on the because long range weapons now are really similar to the long range bombing that is in the days past. And hasn't it been almost all the time? It's certainly the majority of the time backfired on them. I mean, look at Britain in the Battle of Britain when Nazis tried to bring them to their heel by having the Blitz over London and all these other places, and it never knocked them out. And all it did was harden their reserve. Or even in the latter part of the war, when the Allies were just firebombing entire German cities, etc., it never forced them to capitulate. It just made their resolve more, continued to fight. So when we're talking about, these are relatively small numbers of long-range weapons that we even have to give, even if we gave them all of them, I don't see any chance it's going to have an actual impact on causing destabilization within Russia or tactically at the front line.
Well, you're absolutely right. But the problem is that Zelensky is not Daniel Davis. This is the problem. And he has his own view on that. You know, if you look at the polls that were just published in Russia by the Levada Center is considered a foreign agent by Russian authorities, and he published every month a poll on how Russians understands the war, how they see the war in Russia, and also how they feel about the negotiations. And in June and July, 58% of the Russians were in favor of negotiations. Today, in August, as just after the Kursk operation, this interest for negotiation dropped from 58 to 50%. And on the opposite, those who think that we have to continue military operation has increased by also something like 10%. So what you say is absolutely right. The Russians, you know, in Europe and in the West, and generally speaking, we think that the Russians hate Putin and therefore they are ready to change their mind as soon as they are attacked and all that. It's not true. Putin remains very popular, and even if the popularity quote was 87% in July, it dropped to 85% in August, which is negligible. Nota bene, 87% is the number of ballots Putin got in the last presidential election. So that shows that the popularity of Vladimir Putin is very high. In addition to that, Russians are strongly attached to their motherland. And this is something that they have since World War II and probably before, but especially since World War II, the Russians are extremely attached to their country. So the idea that you could make a change of regime, a regime change just by bombing cities deep inside Russia is a totally wrong understanding of how the Russians think. But again, this is the problem is that we are today in a situation, I mean, especially in Ukraine and the West at large, they are in the situation that they have no other solution in mind than just that. That's the problem.
Well, yeah.
They understand that probably we should come close to a political solution, but they don't want to address such a solution before the presidential election. That may come afterwards. But
Yeah.
before that, they want something military, something strong that shows determination, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and let me. And we actually have some examples of some of that, but there's also really contradictory statements coming out from different people. But before we get to that, so that it's in context and people can really understand, why folks like you and I sometimes, just beat our heads against the wall in frustration. Here's the ground truth reality. And I'm going to show you the current situation here. This is the 1,000-kilometer line of contact roughly here. And this is the Kursk operation here. And there has been, in the last 24 hours, a significant change up into this northern area here. You see these light pink areas I'm looking at right here and right here. These represent additional progress by the Russian side in just the last, I think really totally the last 3 days, but the last 24 hours especially. And actually, Gary, if you could show that one video for military summary, because I want to come back to this map in just a second.
First, we're going to talk about the Kursk direction, where, according to information we have, the Russians launched a full-scale fast lightning counterattack, and as a result of this counterattack, the Russians managed to establish complete control over significant, and there are lots of very interesting updates. First of all, the sources are saying that the Russians, as a result of attack, restored control over the village by the name of Gordeevka, Viktorovka, Внезапная, Бяхова, Apanasovka, Vishnevka, Komarovka, Krasnooktyabrska, and the most important, over the village by the name of Snagost, which is the biggest village in this direction.
And so now let me zero back in on this area here. So those were some of the villages where he was talking about that the Russian side has recaptured. And so now then you see that this area here, this light blue, is where Ukraine had punched into Russian territory, and it had been stalled out, as we've been talking about before. But now then the Russians in this area have started to move in there. Now this already has created another pocket where there's a lot of Ukraine troops in here, and the Russians are in, I think there's about 1.5 kilometers or maybe it's 2 kilometers, about 1.6 miles or so, very short, is left open right here. And if Russia closes these off, all of the troops that are in here are going to get cut off. And apparently it's several hundred. But then you look back a little bit further, and according to other sources that I've been able to find, is that there are large Russian forces congregating here and in here. So the ones that probably started this have substantial forces. Just yesterday, the Russian Kremlin spokesman said that they were now in the process of retaking the land. Up to this point, they had been satisfied just basically pummeling these people, bombing them, artillery, drones, limited incursions. But now it looks like they're starting to move them out as well. And when you see that, you can see in the context of the larger, and I'm going to get there in just a second, especially down in the east here, there's a real problem that the Ukraine side is now starting to be in a lot of trouble tactically even. And the question is, will they be able to get to the election and still maintain cohesion on all their fronts?
Well, that's a problem. Now, if you just talk about Kursk or the Kursk area, I wonder if the Russians want just to retake all the territory very quickly. Because so far, by opening this new front on Kursk, the Ukrainian side has extended the front line by something like 100 miles, meaning that that extends also the logistical lines and everything. Basically, the whole Ukrainian forces are more diluted than before. And what they are lacking to counter the offensive in the Donbass is precisely the concentration of force, which is, as you know, one of the basic principles of war. Now, on Kursk, the Kursk issue, the territory in Kursk is more important for Zelensky than for the Russians, because Kursk is a political, basically, they wanted to achieve something that they couldn't achieve, and namely seizing the nuclear power plant in Kursk, but they were not able to do that. But at least they have some territory. And if you look at the media in the West, this is considered as a kind of a strategic success, although technically it's insignificant, because it's an area where you don't have any significant population. It doesn't mean much. But politically, I would say for Zelensky it's important. And more importantly, since it's important for the Ukrainian, it attracts a lot of troops. And in fact, a lot of troops were distracted from the Donbass area to the Kursk region. In the Kursk region, the Russians, they know they will not have the big battle as you can have in the Donbass. And in fact, what the Russians have done, they are doing what you can call a kind of hunting warfare. It's kind of counter-guerrilla. That's for that reason, by the way, the Kursk area has been named counter-terrorist operation area. And what they do in this area is, the soldiers who are affected to this area are called ochotniki. Ochotniki is a hunter. And that's because it's infantry warfare. And if you look at the geography, the topography, and all that, you would see you cannot use tanks and armored units and all that. By the way, all the armor that was used and deployed by Ukrainians in this particular era was almost destroyed.
Yeah.
So and if you look, it's also interesting to see that in the leaked documents that were published in April 2023, you may remember there was those leaked documents from the US documents. And in these documents, you could see that the Ukrainians had planned three possible direction of counteroffensive, because they were planning their counteroffensive. They had the direction of Kherson in the south. You had the direction, and maybe I have a map just to explain that. Here we are. That may explain that. So you have three direction. Here you have the direction of Kherson with a force ratio of 1:8. And in the Kherson area, you had a ratio of 1:4. While in the northern part, and you notice that they had no intent to plan any counteroffensive in the Donbass area, because that's the place where the Russians were very strong. But here in the area between Belgorod and the Belarusian border, you had the ratio, it was close to 1:1. So that was the most favorable ratio for the Ukrainians. But it's interesting that they didn't attack here in 2023. Why? Because this is not a terrain for maneuver warfare. This is infantry terrain. And they preferred to attack here, which is the second best solution, because here they could use the tanks and the armor they received from the German, the Leopard 2 and all that. And you remember what they tried to do in the area of Zaporozhye, Rabotino, in this area. That was typically armored warfare. Here it was not possible. That's the reason why they didn't do it at this time. And now they are coming back to this place. But the problem is that the terrain has not changed. It remains still infantry type terrain. And that's the reason why the Ukrainian cannot have success in this area. And that's probably the reason why they see that they will not achieve anything in the Kursk area. The only thing they can achieve is attacking in the depths of the Russian territory, because at least they will not reach any concrete objective, but they can contribute to the destabilization of, or they should try to destabilize Russia. In my view, this is a totally desperate measure that will not work, but that's probably what you have in the mind of Zelensky at this stage.
Yeah. And in fact, let me just throw another level of problem onto there. Not only was even the chance of it destabilizing Russia very low, because it was an area that didn't have a lot of strategic advantages or interest for the Russian side, which gave them the luxury of just kind of containing it and then worrying about reducing it later. But then all of those troops and allegedly up to 600-700 combat vehicles of various types have been lost in here. Vehicles and men and trained men they don't have down here in the Pokrovsk area. And I want to show you another. There's just a number of attacks have been going on, even in the Kupiansk area, in the Toretsk area, in the Vuhledar area down here to the south. But it still remains the Pokrovsk area is the biggest one. And we've been talking here about some of the advances that the Russian side continues to make in this area. But one of the most critical, probably the most critical, continues to be in this salient down here in the south, to where there is a closing bulge of apparently several thousand Ukrainian troops. And Russia has been making more progress in the south and more progress down here in the north, down near to this Hervink. I can't remember I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right there. Also around this Ukrainsk, which is a very important tactical area here. And this cauldron just seems like almost every day to get close to closing every day. Ukraine is going to be faced with the decision, possibly within days, of either trying to break these guys out or get them out before the thing closes, or they may lose them all. And that's going to be another huge blow. If you've lost all the men up here in the north with the Kursk offensive, and then you have, and I showed you there's already a pocket forming up here in the northern part of this one, even right up in here. And if they also lose some troops down here in the south, Colonel, they don't have troops to lose anywhere and have any hope of even containing, much less stopping the Russians.
Well, if you look at the ratio, I mean, the forces that are currently deployed here, I have also a map that shows, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, these are the figures, the number of Russian forces deployed currently on the Ukrainian theater. And you see that the bulk of these forces remain in what's called the battle group South and Center, which are the two battle groups that are currently involved in the Pokrovsk offensive and this area. You have also a very strong group here in the south. And by the way, we have indication that in the Kherson area, I mean, on the Ukrainian side, that means west of the Dnieper River, you have some operation of the Russian special forces. Now you see here that you have a very important force here. So we may have something in preparation here. I don't know, but all of these figures come from the Ukrainian General Staff, as it is indicated. So we see that facing the Ukrainians, you have a formidable force that is currently deployed. That here, this was the figure about 1 week ago, sorry, and that's about 500,000 soldiers deployed facing the Ukrainians. And we know that the Ukrainians have more and more problems by manning the front line. So we might have a solution in the coming weeks. I don't know. I don't know again what is the level of risk the Russians want to accept, because the faster you move, the deadlier your attack can be. So and so far since October 2022, the Russians have said that they will preserve the life of the soldiers, and they will try to grind down the Ukrainian. If we look at the figures of the weekly losses, these are the figures that given by the Russian general staff, but we see that we have up to last week we had something like about 17,000 people lost every week in Ukraine. That's absolutely incredible. If you add this, you can see that they are losing something like 70,000 yeah, 70,000 soldiers or combatant per month, which is quite dramatic on the Ukrainian side. So this is obvious that the Ukraine cannot sustain that very long. This is obvious, and the Russians on their side, they preserve their life. They move very gradually, very slowly. The again the and also it's interesting because recently the Vladimir Putin said his aim is to liberate Donbass. But it's interesting because it was translated by many media, Western media outlet, as the primary objective of Putin is the conquest of Donbass. And here we have to be very careful about the terminology. When you say conquest, that means that your aim is territory. When you say liberation, that means you want to destroy forces. You destroy the forces that are on this territory. I mean, the US has had to liberate France in 1944. They didn't aim at the conquest of France, but they wanted to destroy the German forces on French territory. That's a liberation. So there is a difference between the two.
Yeah, that's really important to point out.
Yeah, that's a very important thing, because most of the Western outlets have translated that as a conquest. It's wrong. The strategy of the Russians have consistently been the destruction of the Ukrainian potential.
Forces, yeah.
And that's reflected in the two objectives that were defined by Vladimir Putin on 24th of February 2022. Demilitarization and denazification. That means to destroy a potential. On the other hand, the Ukrainians, for strategic and also political reasons, they still consider the terrain as important. And that's the reason why they try to get a hold on every square inch of their territory. And they don't have this idea of maneuver warfare. And that's also the reason why you have those tensions between the general staff and the political leadership in Ukraine, because for the military, terrain is not important, because you can always recover terrain.
Right.
If you lose it, you can recover it. That's not a problem. But forces, if your forces are destroyed,
100%.
there is no way you can recover them, and that's the problem. And that's a rationale behind maneuver warfare. And if you read my book on the Russian art of war, they prefer maneuver warfare. Now, since October 2022, they said we don't make big operations, but as trade-off for that, they proceed very slowly in order to preserve their forces, and they move gradually. Again, for the Russians, the objective is the destruction of the potential.
Right. And and one of the things that I think that it's unknowable, but I see anecdotal information and evidence that's starting to emerge both politically, diplomatically, as well as on the battlefield, that there is some evidence that Russia may have at some point in their mind a certain point to where they think that the Ukrainian lines are fragile enough that they come in with a quote big arrow movement. Now, most in the West that I've talked to say Russia hasn't done that since really the opening of the war because they can't, and they've exposed that they can only do these grinding things, and so there is no big arrow movement coming up. That's a thing of the past. I'm not sure that that's a safe bet, but here's one of the problems I want to identify right here is that all the things that we've talked about up to this point and shown graphically on the map is that the Ukraine side, I mean, we've said this from the beginning, there is no military pathway to victory. There's not even a military pathway to hang on to what they got, and it's now starting to really buckle in certain areas. Now, if you saw that reflected in some of the things that the senior leaders in both the U.S. and the Ukraine were matching that and recognizing that, and they had some kind of plan for it, that would be one thing. But instead, we see almost like this, like they're watching a movie or something, a different movie than what we see playing here. Because let me show you some of the things that have been saying here. Here is the Polish foreign minister, I think just a day or so ago, talking about how there's no reason to talk about a negotiated settlement where Ukraine gives up anything. Why would they? Watch.
Do you think that President Zelensky, the Ukrainians, should just accept that there is a part of eastern Ukraine that they're going to lose and that they're going to have to sit at the end of the day across from the Russians and negotiate?
I'm not sure why you're suggesting that Ukraine should give up its territory. Would you give up your territory? We need to stay the course in supporting the victim of aggression. There was a vote at the United Nations General Assembly, one of the most overwhelming votes in the history of the UN, to condemn the aggressor. This is not a press statement. It's law. And we have a duty as the international community to take countermeasures.
Yeah. So do you want to give up your territory? Well, no, obviously no nation wants to give up their territory, but there comes a point, Colonel, to where you have to say, do you want to give up part of your territory and preserve the rest, or continue to blindly go forward and maybe lose it all? I mean, I think that's the bigger issue, don't you?
Well, absolutely. I think this is this kind of dilemma that has to be solved at political level. But it's interesting to study the question of territory because very recently, a couple of days ago, Sergei Lavrov gave an answer about this. And he explained that, in fact, why should we pay attention to the territory if the people on this particular territory are mistreated by its government? And, he refers to a law, and that's very interesting. And probably that should be reminded to the audience that on the 1st of July 2021, the Parliament of Ukraine adopted a law on the indigenous people of Ukraine. And that's what a politician said just the day after. That was on the 2nd of July. And he said, and that's not in the Kremlin or Russian press, that came into the Ukrainian press. And here Oleg Seminsky said, Russians are not an indigenous people in the legal sense and will therefore not fully enjoy all the human rights and fundamental freedoms established by international law and enshrined in the constitution and laws of Ukraine.
Wow.
As a result, when you have such a situation, the question of territory remains and that's the view of the Russians. The territory is something that is at the second, in the backstage. The more important is the life of the citizens. And the fact of the matter is that the Ukrainians have always considered the Russians as second-class citizens. And that's the reason why in 2014, they changed the rule about the official language of the country. And that's what triggered a massive protest in the whole southern part of Ukraine and eventually in not the secession, but let's say
Rebellion.
the protest of the two republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. And now we are in this situation. So it's fine when we talk about international law. But international law must be seen from all aspects. We cannot just cherry pick one aspect of the international law. If we wanted to protect the sovereignty or the territory of Ukraine, then we should have made every effort to implement the Minsk agreements that were decided in February 2015 and that came into a resolution of the UN Security Council also in February 2015. So, and the international community, especially the West, has demonstrably said they didn't want to implement these agreements. Right. So, it's a little bit late to come with the comment such as the Polish foreign ministry said. This is kind of how to say that. This is a justification afterwards, but the fact of the matter is that those diplomats have not done their work before. Right. And that's why we are in this situation.
Right. Because obviously if that had been done back in 2014, 2015, then there would never have been a war in 2022 and none of this would have even happened. All those people would be alive, but it didn't. And now then we do have the war we have. And now we do have the tactical situation we just described where the Russians are continuing to methodically ground down the Ukraine side. There's a risk that they could come in with more troops and start something in larger numbers here. And in light of that, in fact, if I didn't tell you any of the situations here, and I just showed you this next clip of the U.S. Secretary of State, you would think that he was talking about something on another continent, maybe, because it can't line up with what we see on the ground here, as you'll see.
Ukraine continues to stand strong, and I believe that it's very much on a trajectory where it will be able to stand strongly on its own 2 feet. Militarily, economically, democratically. It will be increasingly integrated with Europe. And Putin will continue to know a strategic failure in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians will know a strategic success in building a strong, vibrant country.
What in the hell is he talking about? Standing on their own 2 feet and be a victorious militarily, economically, democratically, and Russia will be a strategic defeat. I mean, how can those things be reconciled with reality?
Well, I don't know. I think Blinken lives in a parallel world because we have talked about the military situation, but there is also a situation within Ukraine that we tend to ignore because, again, the center of gravity of the Ukrainians is their narrative. This is very important. We talked about the center of gravity of the Russians, which is the stability of the country. But for the Ukrainians, this is the narrative. Despite the evidence, despite the facts, they keep maintaining this kind of narrative that Ukraine is victorious, that this economy is going well, and things like that. And it's totally wrong. I mean, we have seen the Standard & Poor's that have changed the ratings, the credit ratings of Ukraine, and now it's close to the default situation of the Ukrainian economy. So we have the problems. Ukraine cannot export its goods into Europe because they are too cheap. And therefore, they come into a competition with the farming products of Polish farmers, Slovak farmers, German farmers, and all these farmers they refuse to have the Ukrainian agricultural product. So we see that the economic situation is in a dire situation in Ukraine. In addition to that, we tend to ignore very different facts that are happening within Ukraine itself. And for instance, we ignore that there is a very important resistance movement within Ukraine. I mean, I'm talking about the western part of Ukraine. And if you look at, for instance, here I have this example of the Russian Kherson, which is a resistance movement that is very active in the whole of the southern part of Ukraine, in Kherson, but not only. It goes up to Ivano-Frankovsk and all that. I mean, this is a movement that does exactly the same kind of work that the French resistance did in early 1944 and up to the landing in Normandy, which is basically to disrupt the logistical lines of the Ukrainians, destroying the railways, destroying ammunition depots, and making attacks on garrisons or several Ukrainian garrisons. Nobody talks about them, but they exist. They publish regular information bulletin. So these guys are very active. And in addition to that, which is, we don't know exactly who are in those resistance movements, but we assume these are Russian-speaking or ethnic Russians living in Ukraine, or at least sympathizer of the Russian people. But in addition to that, you have Ukrainians themselves who protest against the forced recruitment that we have. And you have daily attacks on recruitment office or the recruitment officers and all that. So meaning that the security situation within Ukraine itself, not talking about all the bombings and the missiles attacks and drone attack from the Russians, but also within Ukraine, you have forces that are actively involved in fighting the government forces. In addition to that, those resistance movements apparently provide also intelligence to the Russians, and that's the reason why they are able to pinpoint
some of these long-range missile strikes.
Exactly.
And you talk about what's going on inside Ukraine. I want to stick with that theme for a second here, because just like I showed you in Poland and the United States, how there's detachment from reality, the same kind of thing is going on within Ukraine. I'm going to show you a couple of clips. I believe these are both from either today or yesterday from Zelensky, and he's going to almost say, and these are two comments from the same interview. They're going to almost seem diametrically opposed. Let's watch first what he says about the tactical situation.
Today there was a report from the Commander-in-Chief Syrsky. I thank all our warriors who are holding the front in the Pokrovsk direction, who are holding the Kurakhova direction, who are really securing our positions. And we are approaching our partners steps that can help now. The main thing is determination. The determination of Ukrainians is more than sufficient. The determination of our partners must become much more long-ranged. We are also working on logistics, the timely delivery of the announced support packages. Every day is a challenge. Every day is a maximum effort. We will definitely defeat the occupier.
Okay, now I just showed you an updated, as of today, tactical situation, and Ukraine is literally getting driven back everywhere now on all the fronts. And he says, no, we got it contained in all these same areas, and we're definitely going to win. I mean, I get it that the narrative is the center of gravity, but don't they take a risk of upsetting their own center of gravity when enough of the Ukrainian people see with their own eyes that there's no truth in that?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, but the essence of the narrative is that the Western politicians believe the narrative. That's the key. That's the target audience. Those are the politicians, not the population. And that's the dramatic aspect of it, because Ukrainians are more and more conscious that this war is not about Ukraine. And in fact, you had in the Kyiv Post, it was, I mean, this is a Ukrainian media, on the 1st of September, so that's just 1 week from now, I mean, a little bit more than a week, was an article saying that the war in Ukraine, a war between Ukraine and Russia, is not about Ukraine. It's a war between the West and Russia. And that was in the Kyiv Post. And that indicates that you have more and more people who, in fact, realize that exactly what Lindsey Graham used to say, that they are using Ukraine or misusing Ukraine to fight the Russians up to the last Ukrainian. And that's exactly what the Ukrainian population is understanding. The problem is that in order to have the support, the weapons, financial support, and all that, Zelensky must stick to his narrative. That's the problem. And that's where you have this dilemma. And that's the reason why you have more and more people within Ukraine who join kind of resistance and civil resistance, or you can call it in different ways, because they realize that their authorities are not. I'm in touch with several Ukrainians, and here even in Brussels, who contacted me, and they thank me to give them a proper image of the situation, because they say they feel that what the Ukrainian government is saying are just simply lies. And those lies.
Okay. Well, now to kind of reinforce that, so I just showed you here where Zelensky literally ended his sentence by saying, "We will definitely," his word, "win this war." Right? So now, almost the next breath, the same guy is saying, "We're going for a negotiated settlement." Watch this.
Among the key priorities of this year is the Second Peace Summit, which means maximum active work with all our partners in the groups of the peace formula on points and a shared perspective of ending the war. I am grateful to everyone in our Ukrainian diplomatic service who is already working in this way for the sake of our state's priorities, and everyone who does not reach this level should decide whether they really should be in the MFA system. In these tough times of war, Ukrainian diplomats cannot afford to be careless.
So that's a little bit rambling, even at that. That's saying we're going to have a peace summit. And by the way, you had Chancellor Schultz from Germany insisting that Russia be invited to this peace summit. But then he turns on kind of on his own people and says, "Hey, and also all of the guys in my foreign ministry." And by the way, he just fired the foreign minister and bringing in some new people. He seems to be threatening them, and I'm not sure what the threat is, but this just seems like someone who is increasingly detached from reality.
Well, yeah, sorry. I'm not sure where I'm sitting, still in touch with you.
Oh, yeah, there we
Okay.
are.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, and you have also Viktor Orban that says that we need to open the door to the discussion with the Russians, because I mean you have some individuals who start to understand that we cannot stick to the narrative. We have to move ahead, and the way we're moving today just leads to the catastrophe. And beside this, by the way, it's not surprised that it comes from Olaf Scholz, because Germany is probably the country that so far suffers the most from the war because of the sanctions. And you see that Volkswagen talks about closing down some of its factories in Germany.
wow.
And so that's massive. And you have already some part of the chemical industry in Germany who have closed down their factories, and you have huge chemical industries in Germany like BASF and so on, and they have closed some of their factories because it's too expensive to produce in Germany. So Germany is currently suffering from the war, and that's the reason why now they are talking about possibly negotiation, and we should move towards peace. Now, the problem is that because we are having always this double speak, double language with Russia. On the one hand, we say we want to talk, and on the other hand, we are just adding sanctions all the time over Russia. So the Russians are considering, with right, by the way, that the Western countries are not completely sincere. They understand that the West and Ukraine will be eventually forced to negotiate. But the Russians are not in a position today to ask for this negotiation. They are in a very strong position on the ground. They are grinding down the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian economy is totally collapsing. And the European Union, despite all the declaration that they want to integrate Ukraine and all that, they cannot afford to let Ukraine to export its goods within Europe because they are too cheap. And at the same time, the Europeans start to realize that reconstructing Ukraine and rebuilding Ukraine will cost hundreds of billions of euros. And for that reason, there is, on the one hand, there is the narrative, and there's the reality on the other hand. The Russians have understood that there is a gap between the two on the Western side. And for that reason, the Russians are very comfortable at this stage. In addition to that, as it was said many times, the Russians are not ready to talk with the Ukrainians because they know that if they reach a deal with the Ukrainians, you will have some kind of Boris Johnson or whoever who will come behind that and say, no, stop that, and you have to continue the fight. And people start to realize also, because it was published in the West, that was published in my first book, Operation Z, that I published in October 2022, that the deal that was about to be signed by both Ukrainian and Russians in Istanbul in March 2022 was very advantageous to Ukraine. But the Russians will certainly not come back to this agreement. They will probably use the same kind of setting, namely, for instance, the neutrality of Ukraine, which, by the way, was already in the Ukrainian constitution in 1991. So nothing very new on that. And the Russians will insist on that. But beside this, I think there is little, if I would even say no chance, that the Ukrainians will recover the territory that has been lost in those 2 years.
Yeah. And it's ironic. We had on our show a couple of days ago a new report out, or interview out with Victoria Nuland, who's rather infamous in this part of the world. Admitting as such that there were negotiations to sabotage that April Istanbul meeting that you referred to there. And also you mentioned about Viktor Orban. Here's what he said just yesterday.
The first thing is that if there is no communication, no chance to stop the war. So communication is the number one. Very few wars in the European history went on without communication with the fighting parties. And what we are doing is bad, because we don't have communication line to the Russians. So we need communication to Ukraine, and we need communication to Russia as well. That's the first. The second is ceasefire. So if we are waiting to have a peace plan which is accepted by both warring parties, there will be never peace. Because the first step is not the peace plan. The first step is ceasefire.
Now, he had prefaced his comments there, I thought, very, very powerfully by saying, hey, listen, I'm not coming at this just as a statesman. I've got a lot of experience with wars. And he said over the 20 years that he's been in power, talking about the Balkan Wars and the things that are going on now. So he said he's coming at this from somebody who really understands, and he seems really focused on wanting to get this thing over with.
Well, I think he's absolutely right. And just beside this, it shows that despite what the West used to say, that this war in Ukraine made NATO and European Union stronger, it's exactly the opposite that appears, because what Viktor Orban in fact implies is there is a strong division in both NATO and European Union, because you have those countries such as Poland, for instance, and you just showed the foreign minister just a few minutes ago. And we see that you have one side of the European Union who is strongly in support of continuing the war, and you have other parts of the European Union who realize that the war is leading absolutely nowhere, and we need to have an exit strategy. And that's all. These countries, by the way, also NATO countries. So I'm not sure both NATO and European Union have become stronger through this aspect. Now, the thing is that Viktor Orban is right, but at the same time, the Russians have not indicated they're ready to go into a ceasefire, because now what they want is, in fact, and probably we are in a devil's circle here, because the Russians want to be sure that the Ukrainians will go towards a solution without NATO. I mean, Ukraine free from NATO, and before going into a ceasefire. They don't want the ceasefire, as the Americans would like to have, not a ceasefire, but they would like to freeze the conflict, which the ceasefire could be the starting point from this. But the Russians, they don't want to start with that. They want to start with some guarantees that we are engaging into serious negotiation before going into a ceasefire. And that's the reason why the Russians are absolutely not in a hurry to engage into any kind of negotiation with the Ukrainians. But at the same time, they don't want to talk to the Ukrainian. They want to talk to, in fact, in French, we have a proverb that says, don't talk to the saints, talk directly to God. And that's exactly what the position of the Russians. They don't want to talk to the saint, Ukraine. They want to talk to God. That means the US, because they know that, in fact, the Ukrainians will eventually do what US is saying. The problem is that the US don't want to lose face, and therefore they don't want to engage into negotiation with the Russians.
And I'll tell you, Colonel, I've started to see a number of evidences pop up that kind of corroborates what you're saying. Maybe even goes a little bit further, that the Russians aren't interested in having any negotiations. In fact, Putin issued, I think, what probably may well turn out to have been the last opportunity for peace on June the 5th, I think it was, or 14th, I'm sorry, June the 14th, when he said, hey, we'll end the war here. We'll take all 4 of the territories we've annexed. That means you'll move off of all of them. And then the war will be over. You'll have everything else, as long as, of course, you're neutral. NATO doesn't play a role, etc. But then all of a sudden they invaded in the Kursk area, and he said, all right, that's it. That's off the table. Now then it appears that Russia is going to say, all right, we're just going to take militarily what we want, and then we'll issue terms. And so we've been seeing things like there's been a buildup of the Belarusian forces up in the north there. There's been reports of significant numbers. I mean, talking tens of thousands of Russian forces massing in the border area just north of Ukraine, in the Sumy area, as well as some other places. That map you showed earlier showed like 130,000 down in the southern part there, not too far from Odessa. You have other things like this article here, where going on right now as we're speaking here, Russia just launches its largest Navy drills of the post-Soviet era. 400 warships right now are being in part of this, and it's also being done in cooperation with Ukraine. You have Russia making deals with Iran, so that's now expanding from the drones now also to the ballistic missiles, according to the United States. The North Korea is also expanding. It's apparently 16,500 shipping containers full over the last several months have come from North Korea. And apparently that pipeline is still wide open. And of course, we have all of the industrial capacity that Russia has been doing, and they have been producing a lot more than what we've seen them use, all of which makes it look like that there is the possibility for a big Russian movement here coming up soon. And the last piece I want to talk about is that this, in a certain interpretation by Lavrov, could be saying, if we make this move, and lest anybody in the West think that they're going to do something stupid like either engage in this war, send troops in, or maybe use nuclear weapons, He's saying he's issued this warning. Watch this.
Americans have this direct association, these conversations, this talk of a world war. They think that if this happens, it would only concern Europe, which is a very showing thing that reflects the mentality of those geopolitical strategists in the US, because they are confident that they will just be safe across the ocean. And in this situation, one has to understand that we have our own doctrine, a doctrine of using nuclear weapons, among other things, and we are now making adjustments to this doctrine.
So what do you make of all of those pieces together? Do you think that there is a possibility of a big arrow move, so to speak, by the Russians? And what would be the results if it happened on the ground?
Well, first of all, I just want to, you pointed out what Vladimir Putin said on the 14th of June, and that's absolutely right. And in this speech that he had at that time, he said the condition to enter negotiation, is for the Ukrainians to withdraw from Donbass. And
right. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe Gary actually has that clip. Let's watch that as you continue on. Watch this.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
So, yeah, that's exactly what he said.
Exactly. So we are exactly there. Now, the Russians, obviously, they don't want to expand this war, and they don't need to, because now they are on the winning side. The problem is, as always, the losing side, because they might not have any other option than escalating the war. Now, if the war goes nuclear, it's clear that, and Jens Stoltenberg, who used to be my boss in NATO for 5 years, he repeatedly said that NATO is a nuclear organization. The name of the game of NATO is to put Europe under the US nuclear umbrella, meaning that if we are going to the point that the war becomes to some point nuclear, that will involve the US. No question about this. And if the US is involved, it involved not just the U.S. forces on Europe, but it will touch all the forces around the world, including continental U.S. So that's what the Russians say is absolutely correct, and they are ready to engage in such a war. You know, the problem is that for the West, they claim they are defending Ukraine. But the Russians, they are defending themselves. That's the difference. And they defend their population because they consider the Russians in Ukraine as their brothers. They are part of the family, physically for most of them, because a lot of them have family, Russian Ukrainians have family in Russia and vice versa. So they protect their brothers. And since all the sanctions and all the measures that have been applied to Russia, it's easy for the Russians to understand that they are attacked as a nation, not just on a few territories, but they're attacked as a nation. Therefore, for the Russian to accept the sacrifice to go into a larger war is probably less of important. It's important, but it will be probably better accepted by the Russians than by the West. And I think here in the West, before talking about all-out war and all that, we should probably think about it, because our population are not ready for war. And you even see that in Ukraine itself, where soldiers say, I'm not here to, I'm not ready to fight the Russians. And despite of this, they are forced to go to fighting on the front. But that's also the reason why you have so many deserters and defectors. But that's another discussion. Yeah. But the thing is that here also we have a dissymmetry between the way the Russians understand their situation, because with all these actions, including the terrorist action that Ukraine has waged on your Russian territory, the attacks on Russian citizens, not just, by the way, in Russia, but also in Spain, in France, and other countries where the Ukrainian Secret Service has just assassinated Russian billionaires and all that. So the Russians are very aware of that. So they understand that it's a war against Russia. It's a war against the Russian nation. And if you go in France, for instance, if you have a Russian name, they will not allow you to open a bank account, just because you have a Russian name. So we are beyond the war in Ukraine. And all the Russians have understood that. That's a reason for which the Russians they understand that if there has to be a war, it has to be a war. I mean, a patriotic war somehow. Yeah. And that will not be the same for the Europeans. It's not even the same for Ukrainians, because a lot of Ukrainians, not all of them, but a minority, but still a strong minority of Ukrainians understand that those territories that have been conquered by Russia should be left to Russia. So a lot of Ukrainians understand the situation, and they understand that the government that was put in place in 2014 that disrupted the good relationship you had between the different communities and different ethnicities that you had in Ukraine, you can understand that this change of government, or this coup, in fact, because it was a coup, this coup changed things. And a lot of Ukrainian, even those I've seen here in Brussels, they acknowledge that probably war was not the best solution.
Yeah, it's a little late to be thinking about that, but anyway. So listen, I really appreciate you coming on today and telling us a lot, because you always give some great information, especially when you bring those maps up, stuff that we wouldn't get from any other place. But man, we really do have to hope that enough people get this information out that makes sure this does not expand into a war that goes beyond the borders, because it could be catastrophic for everybody if it does. And I just pray that enough common sense will somehow seep into, especially to the Western leaders. So thank you for bringing those issues up today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I also pray that we go to some rational type of decision making. The problem is that with our leadership, both in Europe and US, I'm a little bit worried about this.
Yeah. For good reason. We certainly are too. Well, thank you very much, but we'll continue to do that. And by the way, I just want to let you guys know that you can finally get your friends to hear Daniel Davis Deep Dive. To those who maybe only like to listen to podcasts, they're the ones who won't watch YouTube, but they will listen to a podcast, and we now have that available. You can send them to the Apple iTunes podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, wherever they listen to podcasts, they can find the Daniel Davis Deep Dive podcast. And you have to specifically say Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and they can get there. And we would love to have you join with us on there and join us back here. And be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't, because that means a lot more to us than you may think. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.